Well, welcome. Everybody have a good lunch? Hopefully you all stay awake now. Okay, you don't want full bellies to get you too sleepy here. But thank you for coming to Test-Driven Development. This is the first of a two-parter. So the second part will be tomorrow, just before lunch, in the same room here. But this is the intro, where we'll talk about testing and the FHIR specification and how FHIR defines testing. So, hello. When I bend down, I have to be careful. My name is Richard Ettema. I'm a lead consultant with Aegis.net, for those who have not heard me speak already this morning for the intro to FHIR. I'm 35 years in the IT industry. Aegis is a small IT consulting company, and I've been with them now just about 20 years. So most of my career has been with Aegis. But I've been doing health IT development for about 14 years or so. Started out in the private sector, kind of migrated up into some more of the national initiatives here in the US with ONC and the Nationwide Health Information Network, now the eHealth Exchange, and now have migrated on to FHIR with HL7. So I'm a contributor to the FHIR specification, have been for about the past 4+ years. I work with the FHIR Infrastructure Work Group, as well as Conformance with HL7. I'm the senior architect, lead developer for Touchstone, which is what we're going to be talking about here, that I'll be demoing. And I'm also the author of the Aegis Wildfire Public Test Server and Client. So if you're familiar with the current available public servers out there for FHIR, Wildfire is my guy. So let's just kind of pose a little question here. How many people flew in today, or flew in yesterday, right? So from a testing perspective, how comfortable would you feel getting on a plane that you knew was only tested once? Not very comfortable, I would think. So we're trying to introduce this idea of ongoing or continuous testing in what we do. And that's typically with software development, that's what we want to do. We want this automated testing, continuous testing. And so from a FHIR perspective, we want to introduce that as well, too. So another question is, how can an implementation based on an industry standard like FHIR ensure that you have true interoperability? Well, you have a couple choices. One choice is to do your testing at the end of your development. Well, that can be fraught with peril, as I like to say, because a lot of times, if you test at the end, a lot of issues that you could have uncovered early will show up, and now you've got to go back and re-engineer things and so forth. So there's a cost incurred and a high risk of doing things that way. Well, a better idea is to infuse testing into the whole development life cycle. So from the beginning, have the idea of always testing what you're building before you send it out there. So you decrease that cost of testing by infusing it into your development life cycle. So that's what we mean by the test-driven development philosophy. It's a software development technique that implements short development cycles. How many people are familiar with Agile? Okay, yeah, I'm a Scrum Master, yay. So I know where you are. So the idea of Agile, of course, is you have user stories, you have a backlog of things that you're going to do, but you have these discrete sprints of development efforts, usually 2+ weeks of development effort, where you're working on known issues, known tasks, and at the end of it, you should have a functional or implemented set of things, right? But you want to make sure that they work properly. So part of that process of test-driven development is to take that agile process and instead of bolting on testing at some point in the process, we would rather you think of testing as part of the whole life cycle of your development. A lot of times you think of this in terms of writing the test and then coding to the test. So how many people are Java developers here? You know JUnit? Yeah, so same idea, right? You want to develop the test and then you code to succeed in that test. So back in the DSTU2 days, back in 2015, testing as a definitional part of the specification was introduced. Now, Graham had actually introduced testing, or has introduced and has done testing with FHIR from the very beginning. But he had this little unknown resource called the test resource, kind of buried in the spec, that kind of came to light. And through some efforts with the MITRE Corporation, I don't know if you know Jason Wolanowski, he's here with the Cynthia, so forth. So he and some of my team from Aegis, as well as some of the FHIR guys, unearthed this test resource and renamed it into TestScript and made it into a full-blown first class citizen resource within the FHIR specification. And we've included into the FHIR spec a definition of what it means to do testing. How do you test your FHIR implementation? So a framework was defined, which defines what a test engine is within the FHIR framework and what it should be capable of doing. And one of the things it should be capable of doing is executing a test script and evaluating the results from that. So let's kind of take a look at the test engine workflow. So the testing framework in FHIR defines the processes that a test engine needs to be able to handle. So there are 5 basic things that go on here. Pre-processing, setup, the actual test execution itself, a teardown, and post-processing. So those who know JUnit kind of see the before, after, so we kind of model things a little bit like that. But I've started a couple of them here, so we're going to focus on those primarily for the time being. So pre-processing is where you determine whether or not a test script and its interactions that you want to test match the capabilities of the system you are testing. So how do we know what the capabilities of a FHIR system is? Conformance statement in DSTU2 and STU3 and forward, it's now called the capability statement. Same idea. So same resource, just renamed to be a little bit more in line with the nomenclature. So we're going to inspect a system's capability statement, and it's a parsable resource, right? So I can go through and I can see, oh, you support resource patient with operation create and search parameters, whatever. And I can write a test script that will test a patient search with certain parameters, and I can match those up. And I can actually determine, oh, yes, you say you're capable of doing this. I have a test that does that. We're good to go. Okay, so I can continue processing. The setup, basically optional operations that will prepare the system under test. So basically I want to pre-stage data, or I want to delete data. I want to do things to manipulate the data, essentially, to set up the testing environment. And then we execute our tests. And the tests are basically a series of FHIR operations followed by asserts, the rules by which we're going to evaluate whether that operation was successful or not. And then tear down optional post-processing is just for the test engine to collect data so that it can present the results. So pre-processing. If the test script defines the testing capabilities that the system under test does support, off we go. But what if it doesn't? Well, the test engine should allow the test script to be skipped or executed. Why would I execute a test script if I know that the capabilities don't match?
To record the failures.
Yeah, to record the failures, right? I could be in development, right? I want to evaluate potential gaps in what I'm doing. So we're not going to stop. So from a Touchstone perspective, I'm not going to stop you from running a test even if your capability statement doesn't match up. Your capability statement might be incomplete. You might still be working on things. You still want to test, but we will let you know that there is a mismatch. So part of our result information that we give you at the end of your test execution is, did your capabilities match up with what the test had in it? But we're still going to evaluate you, on everything in the test as well, too. So for test execution, we're executing FHIR operations. So we support all of the operations within the FHIR specification, even the extended operations. But the idea here is that Touchstone, or the FHIR test engine, will act as a client and execute whatever operation you've defined within the test script itself. So if you think of the operation piece of the test script, it's a read operation against the patient resource, and here's the HTTP header for content type, whatever it might be, right? So I can define everything from a RESTful perspective, from a FHIR perspective, that I want to execute. Likewise, Touchstone, as a FHIR test engine, can also act as a man in the middle. So if I wanted to actually test an external client, I could then simply wait and listen for an inbound operation that matches what is going on in the test script definition itself. So we can test both sides, client and server. Well, operations by themselves are just that. We need asserts to help us evaluate the results. So a key concept here is an operation is always executed. If you define an operation in a test script, the test engine will execute it. But if you don't have an assert, you're not going to evaluate anything. The assert is the rule that you're going to use to evaluate. So an operation without an assert is, well, just an operation. And you may just simply want to do that. As part of a setup, perhaps, if you just want to run a series of create operations or like a batch transaction to pre-stage stuff, you might want to do that. But the assert, when you think about it, is context sensitive. The context is the most recently executed operation. So a test script is executed sequentially as it's defined. So I have a test with one or more operations, operations followed by one or more asserts. Okay? So the assert is going to evaluate whatever that last operation is. Okay? It states a condition or rule or an expression that will be evaluated at execution time. So basically, it just keeps falling through and running the asserts until the next operation occurs, and then that context takes over, and then the asserts keep going for that operation. But they provide support for evaluation of both request and response, inbound and outbound, complex, simple evaluations of HTTP headers, response codes, the payloads themselves. We can introspect. We can do operators for equality, relational comparison. There's even support for the expression languages for XPath, JSONPath, and everybody familiar with FHIRPath or have heard of it? So FHIRPath is one of the expression languages that is used by structure definitions, profiling, to provide constraints on resource types. Well, we can leverage FHIRPath within the test script as well, too, to provide more complex type of operations or things that we want to evaluate. We can do validation of the payload. So by validation, what we're going to be doing is invoking the FHIR validation engine. So within Touchstone, we've incorporated the Java reference implementation of the FHIR validation engine. I have to make sure I'm saying all these words right. There's also a .NET validation engine. So the FHIR folk who maintain the .NET reference implementation have a .NET version of that as well, too. So, but currently, I leverage the Java for our purposes. But it's an interesting concept. I can replace my Java implementation perhaps with .NET, or I could provide both, and so forth. And there's a lot more in there as well, too. Yes?
Why wouldn't an operation have an assert?
A very good question. I don't believe I've ever created a test script with just an operation and no assert, unless it's in the teardown. And you're going to say, well, why? Okay, so the teardown is a special section where you clean up. But the definition of teardown means I only do operations but no asserts, because the teardown does not contribute to the overall evaluation of the test script. So the setup, if the setup were to fail, then I'm not going to run any tests. And then once I get past setup, I'm going to run through each test. And each test better have asserts in it or it doesn't make sense, right? But when I get to teardown doesn't contribute to the overall success or failure of the test script. So asserts are not allowed in the teardown. So that's one place where you would have an operation without an assert. But to be honest with you, I don't use teardown that often. And there are reasons for that I'll explain tomorrow.
So maybe you need to build something, and you have to go 3 times to the server in order to build it, and then you assert at the end.
So the problem is, once I do an operation and then go to the next operation, I lose the context of the previous one. So in a setup section, what I'll do is operation like a create, and then I'll just test for maybe an HTTP 201, okay, as a very, very simple assert to ensure that it was created. I can do more complex asserts, and I can actually follow the create with a read to validate that the contents were actually created on the server. So I can do a lot of different things there. Okay? But generally in the setup, I'm going to have more minimal asserts because I really want to go past the setup as quickly as possible with some minimal validation there. Does that answer?
Yeah, I mean, part of the question is there a case where the assert you just can't find? I mean, or test? I mean, if you make an assert, you would think it would be logical and be able to be tested, right?
Right.
So do you have that issue as well, where it's just not possible?
It's not possible to build.
To make an assert, or?
So one of the things about the test script and the assert, I mean, obviously we have a lot of functionality that we can do with an assert out of the box. One of the things we found early on was that we may need to do more complex types of things with an assert. And so part of the specification, what was introduced after the initial release, was this ability to do what we call rules. And so you can build a separate rules engine that will support scripting languages like Groovy. And so you could build a Groovy script and call it from an assert in a test script. And so the test engine basically has a Groovy compiler built into it and can execute Groovy. Well, think about it. Groovy is a scripting language on top of Java. So now you have all the Java constructs of a fully programmable language. And the way that we handle that is if you invoke a rule, we send the operation context, request, response, headers, everything, to the Groovy as contextual references. Okay? And that's tomorrow, where I talk about that. But yes, so we did think of that as well, too, because even with all the things you can do with an assert, there are still things that might be a little out of the box that you might have to do. So with that as kind of a stage, I'd like to now get into Touchstone and kind of explain what this thing is. First and foremost, it's a publicly available cloud-based testing as a service platform. So we host it in our internal cloud in our data center in Washington, D.C. So it's publicly available, publicly accessible. It's a platform because it's not just a single server. So it's an architecture where we have a web service, which is what the front end that you see, but behind it is, I've got FHIR as test servers behind the scenes. I've got a validation service, and I've got a MongoDB database on a different server. So I've got a platform of an architecture where I've separated out services so that we can make it as efficient as possible. The main reason for that is we do anticipate expanding upon the architecture. MongoDB allows you to do sharding and so forth, so we can separate out the data. Touchstone is built on a adaptive web interface, and so we can actually do some fun things with the interface, and then with the web service, we could probably cluster it if we wanted to get more bandwidth. So we've architected it to expand, because if you can think ahead a little bit, we might do things like performance and load testing in the future. And so we might need separate instances of it to handle the extra load that we would incur if we did something like that. Yes?
Your second bullet there, consisting of visuals of the FHIR spec, that 1, 2, 3.
So we support 8 FHIR specification versions. And you're going, wait a minute, there's only DST 1, 2, 3, and R4 isn't even out yet. Every Connectathon has a snapshot release that Graham does. So if we want to support testing at the Connectathon, I have to incorporate that snapshot version of FHIR into Touchstone. So starting with DSTU2, so that's the version we started with. So we start with DSTU2, that was Connectathon 10, way back when. Connectathon 11 came along, and so now we're up to version, the version number was 1.0.2, so the version numbers were a little off from that. So we do 1.0, 1.2, 1.4, 1.6, 1.8, 3.0, 3.2, and 3.3. So all of the official releases and all of the Connectathon intermediate releases we support as well.
What about derivatives like Argonaut or
So there you're talking implementation guides where you have structure definitions and all the value sets and everything. That feeds into the validation engine. So if you want us to support Argonaut, which we do by the way, I have all of the Argonaut implementation guide profiles in my validation engine instance for DSTU2. right? I don't have it for STU3, okay? But I have US core. I actually have the Australian base and Australian provider directory because I got contacted by Brett Essler from Oridashi out in Australia. Said, hey, can you support our Connectathon? Oh, I need these profiles. So if you need support for a particular implementation guide, let me know. And just recently, Arden asked me for the MHD profiles from IHE. So IHE on FHIR. So the MHD profiles I just loaded up a week ago. So we can actually do validation of the IHE MHD profiles as well now. Every HL7 working group meeting has an HL7 FHIR Connectathon preceding it, so the weekend before. So yeah.
And if you were going to do, let's say, continue a PhD implementation guide, would we need to contact you to have you implement it?
Well, so basically, all I did was I added the profiles to my validation engine. So we support all of the FHIR operations, even the extended operations. So if you have, the IHE MHD profile, well, really, it's just the base FHIR operations using document reference and, all the XCA type of stuff now translated to FHIR, right? So it's really just validating that the document reference resource instance, per se, matches up the profiles for MHD. And we use the validation engine for that. But otherwise, functionally, operations and other asserts work just as they would normally. So touchstone.com is the URL. It'll redirect you to our actual main site, which is touchstone.aegis.net/touchstone. So it's just a redirect. But this is our landing page. We are going to be updating the interface here probably in the near future over the summer. As you can kind of tell, this kind of looks like the 90s panel type of web interface. That's kind of what we settled on to begin with. So we're actually going to be updating this. We've already done that with our online documentation, so it's all HTML based now. So you kind of get a flavor of what that might look like. But there's some key sections here that we'll be looking at as we move on. But some other things that we need to kind of run through quickly here. Anyone can access Touchstone and view the publicly available test definition. So if I go back, okay, there's some menus over there. Okay, so one of them says definitions. I'm not logged in here. Notice the sign in, so I'm not actually in as a user right now. But test definitions will expand and show you a tree view folder structure where all of our test scripts have been uploaded. You can see them. I don't hide anything. We don't hide anything. If you want to see what the test script definition is, click on it, and it'll bring up a page and show you the context in XML. But the actual test script resources are there for your pleasure and for your viewing, whatever you want to do. You can copy and paste them, whatever. So we're not restricting you from seeing anything, but obviously you have to have an account and you have to log in order to execute something. So execution means that you have to register and accept our user agreement, meaning please play nice, okay? Because a lot of the public test servers have been put up there by the owners of those test servers. My WildFire server is registered and available publicly within Touchstone. So if you just want to play around in Touchstone and run a test against WildFire, have fun, because then you can actually see how things work. If you have your own test server, you can register and define a test system with your server and then run tests against it and compare and just see how things work. Okay? But some key concepts here, every user must belong to an organization. So when you register as a user in Touchstone, if you don't already have an organization that you belong to that's in Touchstone, you can create the new one. Okay? And then organizations may have one or more users based on your subscription level. So we have an open free lane where you can play around, and you're allowed one user for your organization. And then we have a couple subscription layers, levels that you can pay us, so we can actually keep the thing up and running. And so we have a starter level, a project level, and an enterprise level. But to start with, registration is pretty simple. Just click the register. All we need is a unique name within Touchstone. So if you put in a name that somebody else has used, we'll let you know, and you'll just have to put a different one in. A valid email address, so we need to notify you. and then password confirmation, make sure you're not a robot, and register. When you register, you'll be prompted to actually define that organization or to join an existing organization. But once you're in, you'll want to create a test system. So the test system is basically where you give it a name, the base URL if it's a server. The IP address you don't have to fill in. We'll actually evaluate that for you. So if it's got to be publicly addressable out on the internet. And then if you support OAuth 2, we have some rudimentary support for OAuth 2 right now where you can supply the auth token, and we'll send that automatically in any requests from Touchstone. The organization to which it belongs, obviously yours probably. And then we have some privacy settings here. So this is where you can make your test system publicly available. If you don't care who runs tests against your test system, click on everyone. And everyone will see it. But here, the execution can also be controlled. If you want everyone to be able to execute it, you have to click this one. So these are the default settings right now. So let everyone see it, but only my organization can run it. And of course, my own organization can modify it. Okay? Wildfire is set up with everyone organization. So that's why you can see it and execute against it. And then there's a little checkbox here, which is kind of key. Remember that capability statement? So if you want to be a FHIR conformant server, you have to present a capability statement. Well, we use that in Touchstone. Instead of having to go get the capability statement every single time we do an operation, we actually cache your capability statement. Now, if you check that box off, that's giving us permission to, once a day, probably in the wee hours of the morning, Eastern Standard, to go hit your metadata endpoint and go get your capability statement to keep it refreshed in our cache. Okay? That way we don't have to keep getting it every time we run something. Okay? The profiles down here are just how your server behaves. What is it? Is it a FHIR client? Is it a FHIR server? Is it both? Right? Is it a dessert topping? Is it a floor wax? Say it's both. Yes?
The OAuth 2 integration, is that more like just static?
Yeah, so again, we haven't done the whole OAuth dance, with the authorization, authentication. So what we're doing here is providing you the ability to put in what the content of the authorization header would be, assuming Touchstone is the client, the registered client to your server. Okay? Obviously, you'll want to generate a token that probably doesn't expire very quickly. But if you do, we give you another opportunity to enter it before running a test as well. So you don't have to keep coming back here and updating it. You can do it when you go run the test. And speaking of running a test, how do you do that? Well, those test definitions. So here's the expanded test definition. So there's FHIR 301 basic. So I've got a bunch of basic test scripts that I've written. It's a simple little workflow that does a create, read, update, search, vread history, delete. So very nice little workflow that cleans up after itself. But we've organized them alphabetically, and so I've expanded to the patient, and so you can see them appear over here in the workspace area. Well, there are checkboxes next to each one. If you want to run a test script, check off the one or multiple that you want and click Create Test Setup. So you can't run them directly. You have to actually do what we call a test setup. And so you take that collection of test scripts that you've selected, and you go to a test setup, and then you hit execute, and then it'll start to run. So this is the test execution dashboard. So once you hit the execute button, you can now start to see the running tests at a high level. So these are the 4 test scripts that were selected in the test setup. You can see the first one is completed. The second one is in a running status. And you can just keep refreshing this to update the display. We don't do an auto refresh on the web page because navigation-wise, that's a little wonky. So you have to do a manual refresh, whether it's the browser refresh F5 or just hit the refresh button. And it'll just cycle through and update, and you can see the hopefully green bars keep progressing, right? Green is good, right? if you want to drill down into more details of the test script execution. So here we've chosen one test script from the test execution and drilled down to see more information. So you can see the breakdown of the test steps within the test script and how they're doing. We have links to the actual test script content. We have a summary table over here of what interactions have been performed and how they actually performed, pass, fail, and so on. So this is just giving you a lot more detail. And again, we've kind of designed this as a drill down type of interface. So keep getting into more detail. And if you want details of the test steps, just click on that and it'll expand on the page and so on. I'll be going into a demo here in just a minute to show you it live in just a bit. But if you were to expand, say, a read test, so here's a read test that failed. Okay, why did it fail? Well, the read operation should send back what HTTP code? 200, right? So I have an assert. That asserts I get a 200 back. Well, I got a 404. It's a valid response, but it's not the response I expected. So therefore, I'm going to fail the test. You may actually write the test where 404 is expected. And your assert would be where it equals 404, and this would be a pass. So you can imagine doing negative testing here, right? Because I want to test for failure conditions. So success is a failure. But you get the idea, right? So, but again, you can keep expanding. So we have little hide links here to collapse again if you wish. But just get into more and more of the details of the test execution. Another aspect of this is, ever since we fielded Touchstone in October of 2015 in support of Connectathon 10, we've been collecting data. We don't get rid of that data. We keep it. Part of the user agreement that you sign and you check off on is also on our part as well, too. We agree we are not going to give out any of your test results without your permission. We don't announce to the world how you're doing. That's your job, okay? So one aspect of how you can see how you're doing is this dashboard where we've done these sunbursts based on the groupings of tests for that FHIR specification. So for FHIR 301, we've got some Connectathon tests, we've got basic, we've got some advanced, and I can see how well I'm doing across all of them. So I'm actually doing pretty good here. But one thing here is I've got a little bit of a red. Well, why do I have red? Well, what's this big gray swath over here? Anybody been to the FHIR Connectathons before? Okay, so there's a terminology track at the FHIR Connectathon. So I've got a suite of tests that test the terminology operations. I don't support them in Wildfire. My Wildfire server is not a terminology server. Somebody ran, remember I made it publicly available, so somebody ran a terminology test against Wildfire and it got recorded. And I failed it, which I expected. So my question to you is this an accurate representation of my conformance to the FHIR spec? Not exactly. I need to actually filter my results based on my capability statement. So we have a little checkbox up there called exclude unsupported. So that's your little filter. So that's going to turn this into a silver color wherever a test doesn't match my capability statement. So this is how we do that comparison of capability to TestScript, and we'll just filter out your results where they don't get supported. I don't have the corresponding slide for this, but I'm going to show you this when I get to the live demo. Test execution history. So this is just, as I said, we have a history of everything. Okay. Now, are you allowed to look at some other organization's test results? No. So the history for you will only be for your organization. Thank you. What you're allowed to see. Okay. So here I can see aegis.net. That's who I belong to, right? So I see my results. So since I have 5 minutes, I'm going to kind of buzz through the last slides here because I do want to demo a couple things. So these are some statistics based on testing from an organization where they used Touchstone initially to do some testing, and then they came back and then got 100% pass. So we actually asked them for permission to show these graphs, even though we're not even showing you any of the details. We still did ask for their permission. So how can an organization use Touchstone? Well, obviously we maintain existing test suites that you can leverage for basic testing. We have advanced level testing, where I do the new more API level testing. But we can also help you with automated testing. So we have an API for Touchstone that you can launch tests remotely. You don't have to go through the user interface. So imagine like a CI build server, and you could launch Touchstone tests as part of your build process for your FHIR server. So that could be fun. And then you can actually write and run your own test scripts. So you have to actually have a paid subscription to do this, to be able to upload your own test scripts. We also have a Touchstone IDE test script editor tool that you can get if you have the right subscription level. And that allows you to write test scripts and upload right from the tool. We can assist with implementation guides, and we actually have more official training that you can go to. So I have a 2-day tutorial where we go into agonizing detail about test scripts. And you know, I have one person here who has been through it already, so he knows. Okay, and there are a set of hands-on exercises that I do have with this to get you going. And if you want to come up to the testing table up in the mezzanine and see me, I can get you started on those. But what I'd like to do is go to my browser real quick, because now I probably only have about 3 minutes. And here is Touchstone. Oops, sorry, let's do this. So I'm going to sign in. And I'm going to caveat this right now by saying I am a super admin in Touchstone, okay? Which means I can see everything. So please ignore the man behind the curtain, okay? But right here, I'm going to the history page. You can see the history. Actually, sorry, no, not history. I'm going to the test definition page. If I went to history, there we go. So I can see history here. And of course, you're seeing everybody else's history that I don't want you to see. So we'll just go to Aegis. There we go. So I have very good history here. I like my history. So, but the idea is that you won't have that drop down, you know, that gives you everybody in it. You only have your organization. Let me go to the conformance display here. And so here is FHIR 3.3.0. So this is the latest and greatest R4 ballot release, where I've passed everything. Well, what about this slice here? Notice it's silver. I'm excluding that because those are things I don't support based on my capability statement. If I uncheck this, it's now going to include those in my overall statistics. Okay? So that's just basically what that does for you. So it's a nice little filter. But you can use this interface here to actually execute tests. So we've actually built this so you can execute directly from here if you want to. So you don't have to go through the whole test setup process. You can just do it here if you want. And this is all navigable, basically. You can see you can kind of, so if I choose this, I just see those test scripts based on the band that I've selected up here. So it's all very nicely navigable that way. So if I go over here, this is patient intro. So that's the Connectathon patient track test scripts that we've done, and so on. Okay? I think I'm probably at time. So maybe time for 1 or 2 questions, if anything. If not, yes?
You mentioned you have an API that you can use integration to kick off these tests.
Yes.
The result of those APIs, how do you get the results?
Well, so it's a RESTful API, and what will come back is, so you can launch a test or a suite of tests based on a test setup, and then you can execute a query to see the current status of the test execution. And then when you get 100%, when it's complete, you can do one final query to get all the results back. So we have our own XML schema for those results. So, yes? Yes.
Does it also do the data validation of the server itself? Like, for example, it has written the is not told. So is it the right code or something like that?
Well, it's going to be whatever the validation is. So if you have an implementation guide with the profiles, that has the rules in it to do that validation.
So it will be
Yeah.
just for the profile, but not the actual data
Well, no, it's validating the data, the payload. So basically the request or response payload, which is that resource instance. So all that data gets fed into the validation engine. Yes. So it will validate the data. Yes. Anyway, thank you.